Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kidar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisors. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. on Twitch. And if you're looking to support me, it is on my Patreon. Today, we are doing chapter 14 of Breaking Step. The essence, woven through a thick door, didn't react to the knock from the clerk who had led Tibs to Tyrannia's office. He'd intended to show up, knock, and get her to explain everything, but Tibbs had gotten turned around somewhere and found himself back in the main hall. The clerk had asked him where Tibbs was trying to go, and not wanting to waste time, he told her and she'd led him to the door. Tibbs was confident it was the way he'd taken, so, like before, this had to be caused by the enchantments on the building. When he wasn't busy, he'd have to work out how the clerk avoided getting lost. Enter, Tyrannia said, her voice clear, as if the door wasn't there. Tibbs didn't think the weave on the door was what had allowed her voice to pass unimpeded. The clerk opened the door and motioned for Tibbs to enter. Tyrannia raised an eyebrow, her expression going from frustrated to curious as she set the quill in the inkpot. It looked out of place in the immaculate office. It was stained and scratched, and the quill's top listed a finger's width from the top. The quill listed a finger's width from the top where it was broken. "What can I do to help you?" she asked, giving the clerk a nod, who closed the door behind him. "I want to start by apologizing for my behavior when you told me Dawn would be on my team." He'd prepared this part on the walk to the guild and had needed to fill the cracks often as the memory of that conversation angered him. But the ice was thick now, and the anger and amber he barely felt. "I'm a runner, not a child. I shouldn't have thrown a tantrum." She studied him. "And how is he working out?" He shrugged. This one was easier to say. "It isn't the disaster I was afraid it would be." "I'm glad to hear that." She smiled and motioned to a chair. "Now, what is the other reason for your visit?" He sat. "The urchins. Erdian mentioned caretakers. What is that about?" She took the time to set the page she'd been writing on in a drawer before answering. Tibbs didn't have time to make out much, but he thought there had been an M, A, and R at the start of the first word. Was she writing to the guild leader? "You need to understand," she said, closing the drawer. Already she was lying. "We can't treat those orphans the way you were treated. You were a criminal. Your kingdom was more than happy to foster you onto us in return for better consideration when they needed our services." So many lies in just those two phrases. The only thing that didn't glow was the part about the kingdom getting better considerations. With the orphans, the king didn't want to just hand them over to us. Another lie. He demanded concessions from the guild that in other circumstances we wouldn't grant. More lies, but the light varied so much as she spoke he couldn't tell where the lies were and how much of one they were. But we need runners, a truth. And the heroes of Craggle are here will draw new runners, but they will be more experienced ones, a truth. Those who want to test themselves against the floors that shaped you, another truth. But we need omegas. While stronger runners will feed the dungeon more, they will also be more likely to survive. Because of the tribulation Craggle has suffered, we still have to rely on convincing kings to send us those we have nothing. Those who have nothing to gain remaining in their care, and where even feeding the dungeon is with their worth their chance at becoming adventurer. Surprisingly to Tibs, that was another truth. So there are no caretaker. Oh no, they are coming. A truth. And we're making sure housing is being built for them. Not wholly a truth. The way the light did dim and brighten made Tibbs think that the houses being built was true, but that the guild was making it happen, the lie. It simply takes time. I felt it was best not to have them here until those were finished. Entirely a lie. Tibbs didn't look at the drawer, but was that what the letter was about? She was complaining about the leader making decisions for her. Had those come via Erdian? He was here at Marger's direct order. Tibbs wished he could get information about her leader, but this was about getting her to trust him more than any information she might let slip. Are they really getting trained before their first run? You don't trust us? Did you give me a reason to? He asked, not intending to, but the ice cracked. At least the stone had gained no heat. You don't? She stopped. That was good. The words already glowed. She sighed and her eyes flicked to the drawer. Tibbs, as I'm sure you have worked out, I have to follow orders too. Some of the orders I have to give come from them. And they ordered you to let us die? He asked, his tone heating. He filled the cracks, worried his anger would ruin everything. Not. The brightness dims as she considered. Not exactly. I was tasked with protecting the dungeon. It's what the guild does. Not a lie. We exist to guard it and protect the world from them and the creatures they make. That was, and will always be, my first priority. No lies. Don't let how young the dungeon Not how young the dungeon is fool you. Even the weakest dungeon can unleash dangerous creatures without warning in times of upheaval. The light did something odd. The glow was as bright as with a small lie, but it wasn't as there. Tibbs couldn't think of a word that matched what he sensed. Maybe she was exaggerating. Those were sort of lies without being lies, were they? Weren't they? The reasoning still felt right to what he sensed. She chuckled. And don't think there are many trained adventurers here. The administrative staff usually stops training once they reach Epsilon. Not a lie, but a good number of the clerks were Delta and a few even Gamma. You could have stopped Sebastian, he stated, and she shook her head. You're the strongest here. Harry told me that, he added, to explain how he knew it. You and him could have stopped him. The ice cracked and he closed his eyes so he could focus on filling them. Once the anger cooled, he opened them and was surprised that she was still waiting for him to get himself under control. She was waiting for. I don't like it, but I don't know how to shift it. Sebastian Wells, for the criminal that he was a man of power and influence within his city and his kingdom. His king paid attention to him. Because of that, my actions would have been seen as the guild's action, not my own, against a citizen of that king. Not one lie. You're right, I am powerful. The guild is powerful. But we aren't here to hold kings and kingdoms accountable for the actions of their people. How could that not be a lie? Bardic had said the guild had stopped kings warring when it was formed. That meant they got involved. We are here for the dungeon and to prepare for. She smiled, but shook her head. There'll be time enough for that once you've reached Epsilon. Suffice to say that if I or Harry or anyone directly affiliated with the guild had taken action against Sebastian Wells, his king could have decided we were targeting not the man, a criminal, but the kingdom he came from. More of that was true than not, more than Tibs expected. I am not proud of my decision, she continued, the words glowing faintly. But I saw how you organized the runners. I saw a way to avoid drawing attention to our problem, drawing attention. I saw a way to avoid drawing attention to our problems. You know what? I'm removing that. Again, she glanced at the drawer. I saw you hold the man and his minions back and had confidence in you. No lie. You are responsible for some of the destruction, Tibs said. His tone controlled the ice on cracked. She seemed willing to talk about what had happened, even if not entirely honestly. He might as well see what else he could get from her. That was an unfortunate accident. A lie so bright that if its light had been from a lantern, he would have had to look away. As I said, the administrative staff isn't trained for a situation like this, and it never occurred to me the man would be brazen enough to target the guild. They had to react quickly and misjudge how to handle Everburn. A middling lie. It was expected she hadn't told them to sacrifice the town, but she hadn't ordered them to take care not to damage it either. Did he have other questions? And he could get her to answer with. Did he have other questions? Plural. He could get her to answer without rousing a suspicion. He stood. Thank you for answering my question, Tirania. I am here to help, Tibs. You know that. He nodded, then added, because he needed to be sure she considered him an ally. As am I. He headed for the door. Tibs? He looked over his shoulder, reaching for the handle. She smiled at him. I'm glad you came and talked with me about this. I was afraid the animosity was going to fester. The words carried no light. Tibs watched from the rooftop as the workers cleared burnt houses. He wanted quiet. He wanted to be away from people in general, as all they could talk about were the Omegas and what they meant for the runs and their town. He thought looking over Craggle Rock's roofline would make him feel better. They had survived Sebastian's. For as a pain as Ardian was to Tibs, he had the guards do their job, and most of the thugs here to enact Sebastian's revenge were stopped before they did serious damage. The few they missed, Tibs' runners handled. Things were improving. They were bright, good. So why didn't he feel they were? He turned away from the workers and the work. He turned away from the work that would lead to rebuilding and ran. With so many destroyed houses, navigating the town from the roof wasn't as simple as it had been. There were few direct lines from where Tibs was to where he wanted to be. But soon it would be as it was. Almost every hole in the roof lines had workers there. An army of them working toward undoing what Sebastian had done, what Tirania, the guild, had allowed to happen. He stopped before the noble's neighborhood, at the line of demolished houses, creating a moat between them and the town. What would they do as the town grew? Right now, there was nothing but a plain on the other side, but would they stretch this wall they intended to build around as the town reached there? Would they enclose themselves from everyone? Would they turn this enclave of the wealthy into a prison? The idea should amuse him. He used an air disc to leap over the gap and landed on a noble's roof. He moved with care. Nobles paid adventurers to patrol their street, and where was Erdian's protest at that? And they knew to look up every so often. It didn't stop him from reaching a third-floor window unnoticed. Then he was inside and moving about with even more ease. The servants were on the lower floors. People in the kitchen, he sensed, or and in a room on the floor below. The only locked door led to an office. He found the locked metal box in a locked drawer in the desk. He looked through the coins in it for coppers, and not finding one, settled on taking a silver coin. He placed everything back as it should be and returned to the roof. He rolled the coin over his knuckles absently. He'd broken into a noble's home, taken from them. What he'd taken was insignificant, especially compared to everything nobles had taken from those on his street, aimed to take here, but he had done it, and it had been easy. Too easy? Was that why there was no satisfaction in it? Did he need to look for a tougher house to break into? There had to be nobles who used essence as part of their locks. Would defeating one of those make him feel like he'd accomplished something? Something to think about. He looked up, noting where the sun was, and pocketed the coin as he ran. He had to get back to the inn before Jackal worried and came looking. "What did you put there?" Tib had asked Alistair as his teacher made an etching for Tibbs to use as a target. It was between two of the line. It looked like the letter J, which Carino had taught him as part of his letters. "You can make them out?" The man had sounded surprised, and Tibbs had nodded. It was water, so safe for him to say he sensed it, and he'd surprised his teacher often enough by now. Another wouldn't be out of the ordinary. Instead of answering, Alistair had instructed Tibbs to make the etching they were practicing. Now, in the warehouse alone, Tibbs swung two essence lines like Ratcliffe's lasso with that letter a filigree holding them apart. As he moved them, they moved around each other but never touched. Tibbs didn't know what it was for, but if Alistair had used it and not wanted to teach him yet, he wanted to figure it out. As far as he could tell, all it did was keep the essence apart. Since it looked like a letter, he tried with the others, but he couldn't get them to hold their form between the lines and they touched. It was simple to keep anything from happening, but it showed him that while it seems like all he was doing was writing the letter J in essence between the lines, recreating what Alistair did was more than that. "I want you to do the etching and..." "No." Alistair turned, and the etching he'd been about to start making for Tibbs to target dissipated. "Tibbs, this is how... You've had me do this etching for 3 days now. For 3 days. For 3 days now... You've had me do this etching for 3 days now. You've had me do this etching for 3 days. And, okay, and only that one. I don't know why I had this here. I know how to make it." Tibbs had the knife in the hand, forming the etching as Alistair opened his mouth for his usual protest. A line in a spiral to increase the effect of the essence. Then 4 lines through that, meeting in a point. He didn't need to feed it much essence once it formed. The spiral pulled from around without him having to do anything. Then the jet of water projected at his leader. Tibbs wasn't worried. This was just a demonstration, and Alistair had proved he was far more skilled. A gesture, and he had a knife in hand, and then an etching so fine Tibbs couldn't make out details at this distance. The effect didn't manifest as water or ice, just a lattice of essence line on which the water splashed and sent shard of ice back in Tibbs's direction. All he needed to do was impose his will on the ice, and it was water again, then not there as he absorbed it. Despite the demonstration, Alistair wasn't happy, so Tibbs made a concession. "I'll get back to practicing it after you tell me about that letter you did. You did others. One was like a J and the other like a K. I didn't make out all of them." The man sighed. "I'll tell you the basics, but that will be all. This isn't a session on the Arcanus. Am I clear?" It took multiple sessions of Tibbs insisting on more information for him to get what he thought were the basics. Alistair seems to consider the revelation the Arcanus was something within Tibbs' future reach enough. The Arcanus was what the letters Tibbs had learned were based on. The one that looked like J was called Jir and linked to air. Each of the Arcanus was linked to an element, but letters had been added over the centuries to those Tibbs learned. Now, to make all those Tibbs had learned. So, which means I need to change that. Or just remove it. Each of the arcanis was linked to an element, but letters had been added over the centuries to make all those Tibs had learned. There were 16 arcanis, where Tibs had learned 2 and 9 letters. Ka was the arcanis linked to water, Ankh to fire, Bor to air. When Tibs asked for more, Alistair said enough was enough, and training had restarted. He pulled earth essence from his bracer and made a jeer filigree. The line on each side were sluggish as they moved, the way nearly everything he did with earth essence was. Earth was never interested in being fast and stayed apart. Okay, this is not written properly. This is where it goes. The lines on each side were sluggish as they moved and stayed apart. The way nearly anything he did with earth essence did. No, was, because it's slow. Earth was never interested in being fast. He'd taken the time to pay attention to what Alistair did when he etched, so that when Tibs did a filigree with Ka instead of jeer, this time it held, and the earth essence lines slammed together instead of being held apart. He knew each of the arcanas did something different, but he hadn't managed to get Alistair to say. So Tibs was relegated to trying things and hope. Nothing resulted in an explosion. He did a line with water, added the Ka filigree, and connected another line of water essence, ready for the slamming. Only it didn't happen. Instead, when he swung the line, they behaved as if instead of water, they were made of the syrup Mez loved to add to the seared rump of Ashgar Russell made when they could get the meat. Making the filigree with Ankh instead shattered the line of water, as it did with any of the essence he tried. If Ankh shoved the lines apart, coupled them together, would using both mean nothing would happen? He decided to test it with air, since it was the least likely to do something destructive if the unexpected happened. Making the filigree with both arcanis was harder than Tibs expected. He needed to shift his focus 3 ways, the lines, then both arcanis. And when he finally had it, something happened. The combination expanded around him in what felt like ripples in a pond, but it had no other effect from what he could tell. Then he coughed. His head swam. He staggered and realized he needed to break whatever this was before something. Thinking was difficult. He needed to breaking something. There was little he saw he could break, but lines were everywhere. They were where they were, and there were ends of them. Ends he could grasp. His hand touched nothing. Not that way. Think. He had to think it. He thought about grasping them as he dropped to his knee. Then what? End it. Break it. It was easier to pull them apart than he expected, and then he gasped as he breathed air, again rolling onto his back. That had been unexpected. He checked his ice. It was still intact. Even as thinking had been harder, his will on the ice had remained. That was good. He didn't want to think what might have happened if he'd lost it in the middle of this. His essence had been damaged throughout his body. Small rips. He didn't know what had caused them. He didn't know what he'd done. How 2 arcanis, whose effect should cancel each other, had caused whatever they had caused. A weave of purity, and the rips were repaired. He made another one and studied it. Clara called it a weave, but was it? It felt to him like what fabric looked like, which was how she'd compared it, applying a weave of fabric over an injuries, but it couldn't be the same thing Alistair referred to when he talked about weaving. Not the way he made it sound like it was complicated and something only more experienced runners could learn. And this compared to what he felt in the walls of the guild only in the loosest terms. Strand of essence stacked together even tighter than this was. Were there arcanis in those? How did they interact to create what they did? No, What he did with purity had more to do with how he used water or air or earth and the other elements. He applied his will and shaped them. He felt like a weave of purity because that was how he thought of it. But there was no over and under the fabric, the way fabric was woven. It just was. He rose to this temple, unsure if the headache was a result of what had happened to the air or because Alistair was right and Tibs needed to wait until he knew more. He needed to ask Stowe if Arcanus was something he used. And this concludes chapter 14 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, as well as the other in the series, they are up for free on Royal Road. If you want to support me and read ahead of what's on Royal Road, that is on my Patreon. There are about 20 chapters ahead. And if you're looking to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. Links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.